Just like the tale of Old Shep, the tale of the Native American woman Kau-Qua-Tau has been steeped in mystery and attached to all sorts of fantastical folklore that's been passed down for generations here in West Seneca. I think I must have heard a good dozen different iterations of the tale when I was a kid, and it was a favorite of ours to tell one another when we were walking through the woods late at night. But only after Old Sheps, of course. Tom Schobert is a curator of the West Seneca History Museum, and he spent a few minutes with me at the museum's really well put together Kau-Qua-Tau display to tell me the actual story.
This display represents a very popular folk tale in West Seneca about a Native American woman, a Seneca woman named Kau-Qua-Tau, who was a medicine woman. And the story took place, the first part of the story took place in the 1820s. She was a medicine woman, and in the course of her role in her community was treating several patients. And things took a turn for the worse with these particular patients, and one actually died. He was related to one of the powerful leaders of their community. And when he died, the reaction was, well, it must be witchcraft. She must have bewitched this person. That's why he died. So they decided to try her for witchcraft. So she was tried by her people. They convicted her of witchcraft, and they sentenced her to be executed. Before they could carry that out, though, she escaped to Canada. And at some point, they sent a delegation up to Canada to try to kind of sweet talk her into coming back. And so they convinced her to come back to this area. They crossed back over, and as soon as they crossed into Seneca territory, they seized her and with the intent to execute her. And the man who carried out the execution was a man, he was known to the Americans as Tommy Jemmy, but his name was Sunongis. And it was his relative that was the patient that had the bad outcome from Kau-Qua-Tau's ministrations. So they executed her. And they then took her body and brought it back to where she had lived, her cabin, and as was their custom, they buried her under the floor of her cabin. We believe the cabin was on Main Street in West Seneca on the site of what is now an old cemetery. So this was in 1821. Tommy Jemmy was subsequently arrested by the criminal authorities in Buffalo, and they put him on trial for murder. And it was kind of a sensational trial at the time. He was defended by no other than the great orator Sagayawatha, better known as Red Jacket. And in his defense of Tommy Jemmy, Red Jacket pointed out the fact that what was being done was the Seneca were following their nation's laws, their own way of life. And it was done on their own property. And he went so far as to say, and you talk about witchcraft. He said, look back to your own history. Look to Salem, Massachusetts. How many of your own people did you execute for witchcraft? Well, this kind of perplexed the court. He was convicted, but he was not punished. In fact, he was released, and the story died down. Years later, we then move ahead into the 1840s. By this time, some of the Senecas had left. They'd abandoned their cabins here, and the state of New York had acquired the land that was part of the Seneca territory. And they sold 5,000 acres to this German immigrant group that came in, the Ebenezer Society. So the Ebenezers came in, and of course, they had to house their people someplace before they could build their own structures. So they found some of these abandoned Seneca cabins, and they assigned their families to live in certain cabins. A family was assigned to this one particular rundown old cabin that no one knew anything about, and the family was in the cabin, and after a couple of days, they went to their leaders and they said, you know, there's something going on here. There's strange things occurring at night. We're hearing moaning, and we're seeing a vision of a woman dressed in white, wrapped in chains, and she's in some sort of pain. And they were afraid to stay there. Well, the leader of the Ebenezer community, a fellow by the name of Christian Metz, Well, they did some investigating, and they talked to some Senecas that still lived in the area, and the Senecas said, oh, well, that's where Kau-Qua-Tau was buried. That was her cabin. She's buried under the floor. She's probably haunting the cabin. So Christian Metz said, well, I'm going to put a stop to this. He said, I will spend the night in the cabin, and we'll put an end to this story. He spent the night in the cabin. The next day at dawn, he came out. He didn't say anything other than burn the cabin. So they assembled, they burned what was left of the cabin, burned it to the ground, and he assembled the Ebenezer community. They formed a circle around the area. They basically consecrated the ground, and they declared that no one would ever live on that site, and they declared that the area would be used as a burial ground for their people who passed away. And at the Main Street Cemetery, that's around the corner from us, there's an area in the back of the cemetery where the Ebenezers are interred. They did not put markers up because they didn't believe in that, but we know who's buried there because they had a record. So we put a marker with their names to honor them, and it's behind a wooden fence. Now at the other end of the cemetery, in the one corner, is a smaller fenced-in area, and a previous town historian by the name of Frank Lankus, who has written extensively on West Seneca history back in the 40s and 50s, had determined that he believed there were 3 Native American burials in this one spot of the cemetery, one of which he deduced was Kau-Qua-Tau. This was the site of where her cabin had been located. We can't say that with any certainty. We don't know that for a fact, but it makes a great story. And the people that live near that cemetery at various times have reported some strange goings-on, a plate flying off the wall, or one family next to the cemetery reported that they had some fiberglass fishing rods that just mysteriously snapped in half, that type of thing. So it makes a great story. It's folklore. We can't say with certainty that this is what happened on that spot or that there's any real haunting going on. But we recently honored the memory of Kau-Qua-Tau as a Seneca medicine woman with the installation of a historic marker on the site of the cemetery to bring honor to her as a person who was an important member of her community as a medicine woman. The display, which was parts of this were used as a display at the Erie County Fair the last year. This is just a typical example of a Seneca cabin. The representation there is of a native medicine woman in her cabin. There's some items on the table, some botanicals used in healing, tobacco leaves, various berries and that, a little wooden mortar and pestle to mix things up, and a turtle shell rattle, which was used as part of the ceremonial healing rites. And this, just like I say, it's just to show a little depiction of the life of this medicine woman. And we try to bring focus on her, as I say, as an important member of her community, as a healer, and not necessarily as a witchcraft purveyor, that type of thing. So it's always a popular exhibit. It's a little less sensationalized. We at one time had a display that had more of the ghostly image in the back appearing to this, reclining Ebenezer person who was in horror with this thing appearing. And it quite frankly did a disservice to Kau-Qua-Tau, and it was a little too sensationalistic. So we tried to bring this back to a little more of the reality of a medicine.
Well, that's about it for this episode of the Small Town Western New York Companion Podcast. Thanks for listening, and remember to support the small towns of Western New York in any way you can. They're full of great businesses and people who'd love to see you in their towns. The Small Town Western New York Companion Podcast, the TV series, is a presentation of Discovering Western New York and A.A. Augustine Media Co. and can be found everywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thanks for listening.